The journey is conversations with ordinary people about stories of transformation and how we may have had setbacks in our life and how we persevered through those, how we've learned from those obstacles, and how they've maybe helped us on our path today. Well, welcome to The Journey. My name is Kevin Polky, and I am the host of The Journey. And today we have a returning guest with us, and now has become a friend of mine, and she has been a supporter of Shatter Our Silence as well. Sherrie Barch, thank you for being back on The Journey. I know I believe this is your third time that you've been on The Journey, and the first time was in the winter of 21, and then about a year or so later you were back on the journey as well. So welcome again back to the journey.
Yes, thank you for having me back. I enjoy these episodes.
So I know there's a lot of things that I know that you do in the community and with your businesses and different things like that. But one of the things that when you and I first got connected was about your book, Heaven's Bell.
Yes.
And so maybe if you could just share a little bit for our audience, what is Heaven's Bell? How did that all come about? And then yeah, we'll go from there.
Sure. So Heaven's Bell was a story that I had as a little girl that I had made up about what happens when somebody that you love dies. And I always thought that when they went to heaven, they were given a bell and a bell was hung in heaven. And when I thought of that individual or was missing that individual, that bell would ring in heaven to remind them that I was thinking about them and that I love them. And so it was just this story that I always had. And I started to share the story verbally with a couple people, that some children that had lost their parents or their siblings. And the reaction was always, you should write that down. That's a wonderful story. And so what really happened that I think put me over to trying to get this published was COVID. So many people had been losing loved ones. There was not a place for them to grieve. They weren't able to go to church. They weren't able to go into somebody's living room. And so I just decided that I would publish this story and get it out to everyone to be able to open up a conversation about their loved one and tell stories and ring their bells. So that was really and it happened pretty fast. I was able to get the story written and published within probably 4 or 5 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. And again, not being super familiar with how long that process takes, it seems like a pretty quick turnaround.
Yes, well, and when COVID hit, traditional publishing actually had to take a big pause. So I was able to go through Kindle Direct Publishing, they call it KDP, and Amazon. And nowadays, really, to become an author or to be able to share your story, there are a lot less barriers than there were prior to COVID. So you can self-publish and you can put stories out there for people to be able to see and read and hear. I have an Audible, as well as the Kindle, as well as hard publication or print, as they call it.
Sure, sure. Well, and I know for me, and I've shared this with you, that the timing of reading Heaven's Bell and you and I meeting was integral in my own grief process. My father had died from cancer in the beginning of November 3rd of 2021. I was introduced, to yourself as well as Heaven's Bell in December of 21. And I know for me in my journey, it has been very much a metaphor that has allowed that piece, that aspect and that piece of being able to still be connected to my father as well as other loved ones and people that I care about. And equally, in, as I've been counseling or just sharing with individuals, I have probably, I can't even, I don't even know how many times I've told a story, as well as, I do a homicide support group and I've shared it there, as well as Shatter Our Silence, have utilized the story. And to your point, my probably it, my version of the story, right? That
Right.
the idea of how that goes, because sometimes, depending on who the audience is it's, the of the two characters, the boy sometimes is the one that's in heaven, sometimes is the girl.
Yep.
And but to your point, that part of it doesn't really matter as much.
Right. And I think the version of a Heaven's Bell story that I wrote about in my book is just one.
Mhm.
So it's two middle schoolers. One dies and goes to heaven. That's Cody. Ashley lives a long life on earth. And the book is a parallel from what Cody is doing in heaven and how a middle schooler would describe heaven, right? Grand hallways and screens and bell hangers. And Ashley on earth is having a dream about my story that I had when I was a little girl, that there's bell hangers and you can ring bells in heaven. And then in the end they meet up. And it's but that's just one Heaven's Bell story.
Right.
You have multiple Heaven's Bell stories. And I can even see where, somebody in heaven might have multiple bells hanging.
Yeah.
And all those bells make this beautiful noise when people on earth are thinking of them and their loved ones are thinking of them. But I agree with you, Kevin. Everybody has a story that they can tell about a loved one. And I think the more we have the opportunity to reduce those barriers, tell those stories, you actually learn other people's stories of your loved one. And it just creates more energy, more healing, more opportunity to make it a less taboo subject.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just such a difficult subject for so many people. And I just want to be able to use stories and storytelling to make it more comfortable.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the beautiful thing about it is that it gives language and gives permission for people to not only have those conversations, but to frame it in a way that it allows some of the healing. It doesn't, as we know, it doesn't change the fact that that person physically isn't here anymore, but it gives it gives language to what actually is happening. When I'm counseling someone, and we talk about, that, you know let's say the deceased, is his name is Bob. Bob may not physically be here anymore, but because we're talking about Bob, because you're thinking about Bob, Bob really hasn't gone anywhere. Bob is still here. And with, I think the beautiful thing about Heaven's Bell is it gives it language of what that is, because we'll hear it all the time, like, well, the cardinal, they'll see a male cardinal, and then that'll remind me of my loved one. Or for, someone else, it may be a dragonfly, or whatever
Yes.
it may be. And I think that the first time, for me at least, is that Heaven's Bell gave it this formalization of a story or a metaphor that people then could adopt and adapt it to their own experience.
Yes. And I think my experience when people finally had the courage to read the book, because a lot of people don't even want to read it. Are you kidding me? This is a book about grief and somebody passes away. No. And I just read it, which is why I put it on Audible, because I thought, okay, just listen to it then. And what happens at the end, and I think I've said this before on your other episodes, is people immediately feel like they can now talk about Bob,
Yeah.
or they can talk about their loved ones in a way that before they read the story, they didn't want to burden people, or they weren't sure they could trust their own emotions, or it was okay to be angry, or it was okay to be upset. And that's what the book does, because Ashley goes through all those feelings. I'm upset. Maybe I met a friend, and maybe I shouldn't be friends with people too soon. You can take that into your own life, whether that's a marriage or whether that's, doing anything social after a death. I mean, there's so many taboos that I'm hoping the story just allows people to open up and talk about how they're feeling. I feel angry. I feel lonely. And I think there's something about that aged kid, those middle school kids, that can teach us so much. You know, sometimes as adults, we try to protect them, or we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to get them upset. And I think what happens is they don't understand, well, why aren't we talking about Uncle Bob? Or why aren't we, I'm upset. I can tell mom's upset or dad's upset. And then all of a sudden we just go into this kind of cone of silence where we don't want to upset either one. So we just fade and don't talk about it. And that's not how healing happens, in my opinion.
No, no, I agree with you. And and there is this being, like anything, right? Being able to talk about, uh to give language to it, is there is no, I think the beautiful thing about a story is that it allows it to have the freedom for the person to take it on as their own. And and I appreciate all the research that's been done by professionals to also help kind of describe what people go through. But at the same time, I think our human tendency when that happens is then we start looking at it like a checklist.
Yes.
And and okay, so this is where I'm experienced now. I can identify with that. So now this is supposed to happen next. And it's like, that isn't how life really works. Um, and
No.
and I think, Catherine Kubler-Ross is probably most famous for her research. And I think we've talked about this before, that she's been misquoted so many times that her research was never, number one, it was originally for people that were terminal, and what she observed, the stages that people were going through as they were dying. And it was a description of what she observed versus a prescription of what people were going to go through. And then
Yes.
later it got adopted to, oh, is this what happens when we grieve too? Which I think is probably a little bit less tangible than the than someone who's terminal going through it, or a relationship that is, ending. and
Yes.
and I think it's more of a description of what's going on, where I think like Heaven's Bell story is, it allows us to have, okay, so this is Ashley's experience. And then, so I don't have I don't have to look at it as a prescription. I can just read it as a story, and I can identify with it, or be open to what she's experiencing.
Right. And be able to go to a place that isn't mine or yours. It's Ashley's. And then you and I can have a conversation about Ashley's experience. And
Yeah.
I want to see your response. I felt the same way, or I never thought about it that way. It's like a book club, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my goal would be that this is a story that then people that are grieving could come in and say, what did you think? It's safer,
Yeah.
or even as a family, just to be able to have that opportunity to be able to not make it so vulnerable that you're using I feel, but you're able to look at that story and say, I wonder, I wonder what that was like for her.
Yeah.
Or did you ever feel like she did? Or do you really think Cody in heaven, do you think that's really what happens in heaven? What do you think happens? What do you think's going on right now?
Yeah.
Which is why I did the journal, right? Because when people read the book, what happened after is they just started talking about their loved ones.
Yeah.
Here's what I think is going on. Here's what I think he's doing. So I added a journal to the series, which just asks, again, I think crazy questions like, what kind of music do you think your loved ones are listening to in heaven? And, what do you think he or she's cooking up there? Or are there things you do here on earth to extend their special gifts that, they brought to the family? Just, again, conversation prompts, just starters that keep that individual front and center, and that the healing continuing. I think the worst thing we can do is just not communicate, and to feel lonely and go silent and not want to be a burden. I don't want to talk about their death because I don't want to upset anybody. We have to have pathways for that connection.
Yeah, I agree. And I know that, as I mentioned earlier, that I have over the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity and honor to run a homicide support group. And these are individuals who their life has been altered because their loved one died as a result of some form of homicide, right? And
Mm,
there is a variety of scenarios, the whole continuum from individuals that it's a completely a cold case, they have no suspect at all, and it's been 10 plus years, and other times it's been someone who has already been convicted, already going through their prison sentence, and is up for parole. And so
mhm.
we've had the whole continuum of that, and then these individuals can come together sharing their story,
Yes.
which then allows other people, because it's similar to other type of traumatic deaths, is that they feel even additionally that no one's going to understand. Because of it, um because of the traumatic aspect of the how a person dies in
Yes,
a homicide or a suicide, or some type of accident scenario, that it complicates the grief process.
it
And
does.
and then, like in these individuals case, it complicates the grief process because there's a court proceeding, or they're longing for a court proceeding that hasn't happened, and they feel like you know the 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 accused has more rights than their deceased. Um,
Right.
so let me so I don't go off too far off of the bunny trail with that. I wanted to ask you. Now it's been 4 years, three years or so since you published the Heaven's Bell. What are some of the stories that you've gotten back, or
Mm,
response? What are some things that stand out to you, that you've heard from people that have listened to it or read it, that just kind of jump out to you?
mm. Well, to go off of what you just said, um, you don't realize how many people can't get to grieving when there's unresolved anger or conflict, um, in their minds or in their lives, to be able to, they almost look at it as lateral. You have to resolve this before I can move on to grieving. And so there was one gentleman that read the book and talked about Vietnam, and
Mhm.
that he hadn't thought about some of his fellow soldiers since that time. Highly religious man, and again, this book is not religious. That's not. I mean, we talk about heaven, but only again from a middle schooler standpoint, to say, okay, up above there's a heaven, and what does that look like? But so that was interesting. It's someone else that said, she was a caretaker for her husband for the last several years, and the book allowed her to go back in time and think about him and remember him in heaven, healthy and happy. And she was able to choose to go back to when they found love and all the traveling that they did, versus the recency of his illness and his suffering and his death. um, we had someone else, accidents where, a child was killed, another child was a drug overdose, another child was a suicide. And here in society and on earth and what they were dealing with, this book took them out of that and into a place that they really could remember and love and grieve and find joy in going back, or going over some of these recent, and current taboos or just cultural pressures. And so that was really amazing to me,
Mhm.
um, that people, but the story was able to take them out of their reality
Yeah,
and bring them to a place of joy.
yeah, yeah. No, I very similar. That was my experience as well. And I think that the combination of other stories, either via movies or books that I've read, that I think Heaven's Bell kind of helped me bring all those things together. I mean, I remember a scene from The story then later made a movie of The Shack, and there's
Mm,
a heaven
yep.
scene there,
Yes.
and it just remind me of the main character being reunited with his father, and his father wasn't who he remembered him to be, the impression he had of his father when he was living, but it was the uh, transcended father that
Yes.
was who he really was, the ideal or the um, the enlightened father, not the one that he experienced who was abusive on earth. And so,
Right.
and they were able to forgive each other and ask for forgiveness in that scene. And I think there's elements of that
There
uh,
is.
also help with that healing as well. So let me ask you, Sherrie, and again, I know this is a very much a loaded question when I ask this, but what would you like to have the next chapter of Heaven's Bell be able to do?
Help more people. I mean, if there's an opportunity to be able to introduce the story into, like a book club format or the libraries. I mean, I've been invited into schools, middle schools, high schools, and the response has been incredible because it's creating a space for people to show up and have conversations. But we can have these conversations outside of a grief support group. If more people, maybe along with the casserole that they send over, they put a journal and that story there. The journal has places to be able to draw at also all ages, draw pictures or, you know, tape mementos in there from, concert tickets or just anything that we can do to give this resource to people that are needing to not be lonely.
Yeah,
That's so important because if we can start the conversation and the communication and people can understand that it's not anything to be afraid of and that you don't have to show up with answers, just show up with some curiosity, show up with some room, be present. That's it. And hold still. I think the people that are experiencing the loss and having the common story to talk about will make it less vulnerable. I think that would be amazing. And I try to speak. I try to give books away to good causes. Anything I can do to help get the story out, I think is my purpose. I'm not like you. I am not a counselor. I am not good at death and grief. So I do not claim to be so. That's why I've shared the story because it was my way of being able to help people see that here's a little story. Here's what I think of. What do you think? And it's a conversation starter. It works every time.
yeah, perfect. Well, Sherrie, thank you again for being on here. I always enjoy our conversations and just the ideas that come from it when we talk. What if someone wanted to either get in contact with you or get a copy of either the journal or Heaven's Bell? What's the best way to reach out to you? What's the best way to get a copy of the book?
Sure, it's on Amazon. So just go to Amazon and put in Heaven's Bell, Sherrie Barch, and you'll find it, and everything is right there. And if you need to contact me, which I would love, you can just contact me at Sherrie, Sherrie, at heavensbell.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sherrie. And I always, like I said, I always appreciate you as a person and appreciate our conversations. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin.
As you listen to Sherrie and I talk about Heaven's Bell, and if it brought up anything for yourself and you haven't had the opportunity to read the story or be introduced to the story, definitely check that out. You can look up Heaven's Bell. Heavensbell.com is also a website that Sherrie has as well, and you can get more information about that. As always, thank you for being there, and I look forward to being with you next week.